Dark influences. Living unchained. Living unchained means you are free to enjoy every aspect of your life. My sincere hope is that you will choose to live your life free and unchained, unmessed around with, a tranquil yet vibrant life where you walk unconcerned and untouched by the nonsense of the day, filled with humble power and strength. I know this life is possible. No matter where you are today, I thank you from the bottom of my heart for spending time with me. Hope and solutions have arrived. I had planned to create this recording a few years ago, and I'm so glad that I held off because since then I have learned so much about how dark influences operate in our lives. Out of the gate, I want to make sure we're on the same page with what dark influences are. You can call them what you will: negativity, evil, despair, the boogeyman, fear, degradation. All the energy is the same. It comes from the same source. To this dark energy, your life is the equivalent of food and drink. You will recognize this dark influence because you can feel it eating up your life. You think to yourself, I should be happier than this. This makes no sense. Or I don't want to feel this way in my heart. Why am I acting this way? Dark influences subdue your intellect and cause you to think, feel, and behave in ways that are less than smart. Dark energy must consume bits and pieces of your life or your entire life to sustain itself. Hear me clearly. It's a pure seek and destroy mission, and you would be making a huge mistake to underestimate the magnitude of this singular force set to destroy your life. To live unchained, you must adopt a see and destroy mentality. See as in SEE. This means you must see these dark influences very clearly for exactly what they are: the equivalent of street gangs and criminals in the spiritual realm. These influences are renegades and lawbreakers. They come into our lives through the unattended windows and doors that we unconsciously leave wide open. In part 1 of Dark Influences, I will explain what dark influences are, how they enter our lives, and how to know if a dark influence is present in your life, as well as the reason fear is a feast for dark influences. What are dark influences? Dark influences are a collective force of pure negative energy that can express itself in hundreds of ways. Think about water. Water comes in the form of ice, snow, and steam. But when you get down to it, it's all water. Dark influences can take the form of abuse, depression, fear, hate, confusion, fighting, envy, greed, self-hate, worry, uncontrolled lust, isolation, revenge, illness, childhood wounds, stress, and so much more. I strongly believe that over 75% of what we label as mental illness is rooted in spiritual imbalance and interference of dark influences. I've witnessed more than a few people driven to the brink of insanity, and I do mean the brink, and be rescued when spiritual balance and healing is restored. Dark influences enter our lives through portals that open up by a lack of grounding and connection to Source. Source meaning God. Wounds and emotional scars create a perfect opening for these influences to pop right on in and take root. Like many traps, very easy to get into and difficult and often painful to get out of. When dark influences take up residence in your life, the influences fight so hard to stay, because without your life and energy to feed on, dark influences are left to experience the abyss. So in a very real way, these influences fight like gladiators to leech onto your life because they are fighting for their lives, or the closest version they have available to a life. What is the abyss? The abyss is the empty void, the nothingness. There are no possibilities there. For a description of the abyss, imagine the worst day you've ever experienced and intensify it by 5,000 times. And now think of everything going black. On top of that, your only shot at some pleasurable diversion is to hitch a ride on some decent person's back. Now you have an idea of why dark influences fight tooth and nail to stick around. It's been so sad for me to realize in my practice and in life how many people are affected and don't realize what's happening to them. This is why I'm so passionate about this work. I've lived through my own epic battle with dark influences, and now I help others gain victory. My battle started at a low point in my life when for the first time I was so depressed, I began to contemplate what it would be like if I just weren't here to deal with the pain any longer. I was isolated, lost in a sea of sadness with no hope. These are prime conditions for dark influence to take hold. I'm positive I look like a succulent leg of lamb to the dark influences that would soon crash into my life. I loved God in my own way, but I hadn't cultivated any real connection with Him built around a sincere, heartfelt desire to do so. I felt like a throwaway in life and truly alone in this world. My despair had opened up a door. I didn't open up the door intentionally. It was just such a sad time, and I was longing for something or someone to come into my life. So guess what? Something did come into my life. Intense longing and sadness is like a hot pink electric flashing invitation for dark influences to join you. These dark influences become something of a perverse, degrading companion that manifests in depression, despondency, anxiety, confusion, oppression, uncontrolled emotions, and in some cases, total disconnect from self. Please note, dark influence can also appear in the human form. I worked with a woman who had been abused most of her life. She was bitter, angry, depressed, and kept falling into one abusive relationship after the next. She became angry with me when I explained she was giving the dark influences permission to enter by not attending to her wounds. Like this woman, I had not attended to my wounds. Even though I stopped feeling like I wanted to erase my life, it would be months and years before I reclaimed my life after that darkness stepped into it. I felt like a zombie most days, existing, unable to connect to life and people deeply. There was an ever-present dark influence that I could not see, but I very much experienced. I would have done anything to help myself, but I was powerless and lacked the information to set myself free. Many of the so-called God-fearing people I met along the way made matters worse by judging me instead of offering help. Where I did find what I thought was help turned out to be scams rooted in more degradation. I lived through a nightmare. How do you know if dark influences are present in your life? You know you have a dark influence in your life if despite your best efforts you can't explain away your degradation and suffering using the linear laws of logic. When you use linear logic, everything should line up perfectly, but in your case it doesn't. The medical exams can't explain what's going on with you, nor can a visit to your local mental health center. When you expand your thinking to include the spiritual laws of logic, everything actually makes perfect sense because dark influences can't be understood using linear logic. The dark influences enter through the spirit and exit through the spirit. Therefore, this is a spiritual conversation, and the total cure is spiritually based. So what is the first step to cure and healing if you're flanked by dark influences? I cannot express this enough. Take a special note. The first step to conquering dark influences is to move away from fear. You have to move out of fear. Why? Please take a moment to imagine something you're afraid of. Is it spiders, dogs, heights, swimming? Your first thought when you think of the object of your fear is likely, I don't want to go near it. Anything you fear will automatically inhibit and control you. People stay in abusive relationships because they fear leaving. People stay on jobs because they fear they can't do better. People let wonderful relationships slip away because they fear being vulnerable, looking like a fool. And so many people never challenge these dark influences because they're so afraid to do so. The primary tactic of control that dark influences utilize is fear. Had I not been so afraid of what I was experiencing when I was being flanked by dark influences, I could have broken the grip of dark influences in my life with God's help and freed myself a lot sooner. Crazy as it may sound, you can begin to move away from fear by infusing levity and laughter into your circumstance, even if you feel there's nothing funny or light about what's going on. I remember sitting in my living room some years ago feeling physically uncomfortable and emotionally bottomed out. It was the oddest thing because I knew in my soul these effects were not emanating from my spirit. My soul was good, which is why throughout this period of degradation, I could remain loving and kind. I sat on the couch and laughed and kept telling myself over and over again, this isn't coming from me. This is not coming from me. I'm being beat down and harassed by a puff of air. I was fighting with forces I could not see that really amounted to a puff of air, if that. The battle was taking place on the psychic turf of my mind. I was terrified. But the jokes made me less and less afraid. And I noticed I started to feel better bit by bit. The strength I needed to fight was being consumed by fear and doubt. When we infuse levity into the situation, we take power back from the dark influences because we start to see how weak these influences really are. We become less afraid and start to wake up from the illusion that the situation is hopeless. It's not hopeless. If you feel at all hopeless, say this prayer often. Father God, I'm afraid in my own skin. Please help me overcome this so I am not toppled by dark influences that are nothing more than a puff of air. Help me to be bold and strong and take back my life. Another step you can make is simply stubbornly refusing to be afraid anymore and start doing things that normally would frighten you. Force yourself to take a stand. And this boldness will begin to permeate every area of your life. In part 2 of this program, I will discuss healing solutions that can rid you of dark influences once and for all. Stay tuned.